My name is Carol Hamilton. I'm the Director of Planning and Conservation for the town of Wilmington. I'd like to welcome you to Wilmington. This is a fairly historic occasion. I think it's probably the first time, certainly in the history of these three towns, that we've all met together as a planning board under one roof. This project is historic as well. It spans three towns, three regional planning agencies, and of course the three planning boards. We are televising this evening, and I have one announcement to make, and that is that we are streaming live on the web. The website is www.ustream.tv/channels/WCTV_live-Z. Anybody that wants it can email me in the morning and I'll send it to you. This is a public meeting. It is not a public hearing, so we're not taking testimony here. This is a time for discussion and hopefully constructive discussion. If you hear or see things that you think could be tweaked or changed, please offer your suggestions. That's what we're here for. This is a working meeting for the three boards. I'm going to serve as moderator. Our chairman, Mike Sorrentino, wasn't able to be here tonight. So if you'll indulge me, I'll take his place. I'd like to recognize the planning boards and ask if you would introduce yourselves around the table. Tewksbury is generally sitting on this side, and if you would start.
Sorry. Steve Johnson.
Thank you.
Nancy Reed.
Vin Spada.
David Plunkett.
Steve Sadwick, Director of Community Development.
Bob Fowler.
Lynn Anderson, Town of Andover.
Jim Banda, Town of Wilmington.
Joan Duff, Town of Andover.
Ann Urick, Wilmington.
Mark Yanowitz, Andover.
Paul Salafi, also from Andover.
Brian Corrigan, Wilmington.
Rondi Holland, Wilmington.
Paul Matarazzo, Director of Planning, Town of Andover.
The format this evening is that we're going to have a presentation from our consultants, Vanessa Hengen-Breslin. Farrell Madden is our form-based zoning consultant, and Robinson Cole are our legal consultants on this project. We'll have a presentation. There'll be an opportunity after that for comments and questions, and then next steps will be announced at the end of the program. So I'd like to turn it over to Ken Schwartz from Vanessa Hengen.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, everyone, for hosting this. It is a historic occasion, and we appreciate very much hosting and having us here tonight. My name is Ken Schwartz. I'm Director of Planning at VHB. Let me briefly introduce members of the team. Jeffrey Morrison-Logan, Project Manager from VHB, Matt Lawler from Robinson and Cole, and Jeff Farrell from Farrell Madden. We have roughly about a 30-minute presentation, and our goal, I think our collective goal, is to get you out of here by 9 o'clock so that you can all see the opening tip-off. So we're going to briefly go over the process, where we are, how we've gotten to this point. It's been roughly about 10 months that we've been working with the three towns in the preparation of the vision plan and the form-based code. And then we're going to turn it over to Jeff Farrell for an overview of the form-based code itself. It's now posted on the website. I see many of the people in the audience have a copy of it. Jeff is going to walk you through it and kind of touch on the high points of it, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. First off, we call this slide "Why You Should Care." And I think it's very important to sort of identify the importance of what you have before you. And there are a number of kind of highlights in terms of why we should all care about this. First of all, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There are not many opportunities like this in any of the metropolitan suburban communities in and around Boston that will, with the new interchange, have so much land made available for development. And the fact that you are here tonight as 3 planning boards working in a highly collaborative setting and proactively planning for what each town would like to see is really an historic and momentous occasion, and something that we as planners don't see all that often, and you should be commended for being as proactive as you are and in terms of identifying and creating the vision for the future and enacting land use regulations and land development regulations. It's an opportunity to shape the form of future development, what you would like to see the form of development being in the future. There are clearly economic opportunities, economic tax benefits for all 3 communities. There are opportunities here to incorporate sustainability and smart growth into the code itself, and we'll be talking a bit about that this evening. And then there are opportunities to enhance the open space network, particularly around the Shawshene River, that we have incorporated into the code as well. I'd like to just briefly highlight some of the facts and figures in terms of the acreage of what we're talking about. Roughly, we have a study area of approximately 1,190 acres. It's broken down into the 3 communities, as you can see there. Andover, approximately 550 acres, Tewksbury, 270 acres, and Wilmington, 370 acres. As part of our planning work, we looked at all of the constraints: wetlands, setback requirements, easements, riverfront protection, all sorts of constraints to development. And when you factor those in, wildlife habitat, and Jeffrey will touch on this in a moment, approximately half of those 1,190 acres, about 591 acres, are developable. And right down in the 3 communities, 195, Tewksbury 95, and Wilmington 101. So we thought this was important just to provide the context to the 3 planning boards in terms of the breakdown of land that we're talking about that's suitable for development in the 3 communities. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Jeffrey Morrison-Logan, our project manager, to continue the presentation on the process, where we've been, and how we arrived at the vision plan. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Can you still hear me okay if I'm up here? I'm a little taller than Ken, so my proximity to the mic's a little different. But really quick, I think echoing on what Ken said, there's been a lot of work that's gone into this to date. Goes back to 2007, and many could probably argue even beyond that when the first interchange was contemplated. So a lot of work has been done. This has really been the basis for the workshops and the charrettes that we've been doing in the fall and back in January that have led to the stuff that you're going to see in the form-based code tonight. So I think you need to recognize that we've come a long way, and you'll see a lot of the details that build on this prior work that was done. This is the mixed-use centers plan that was done in 2007 that for the first time really identified the different nodes, the different land uses that were contemplated in that same study area. Ken mentioned there's a lot of assumption. I think that's important to understand that while you're looking at some of the graphics that Jeff's going to walk you through, there's a lot of things that are somewhat moving assumptions, somewhat reflected in the work that we've done. But here are some of the highlights about the wetlands. We've thought about that. Setbacks from the wetlands. We've thought about setbacks from the riverfronts as well. Easements that are in that area, floodplains that are in the area that affect where the development can and cannot go. There's natural habitat that affects many of the locations through this area. So we have to make assumptions about how development can happen and percentage of development in there. Again, that was very informative to development of the form-based code. And the interchange itself, where the highway interchange is, what the options that Mass Highway and their consultants are pursuing, all of those are important factors in where we can connect development in and get connected to the system. This idea about West Side access, I know that's been a lot of discussions over the months about that, and that continues to evolve, so we made assumptions about that's going to get resolved as the plans move forward over the next few months. And lastly, the Superfund site, and here you'll see that we've actually shown in some of our plans that there could be development there. We wanted to go back and remind people that the intent here is not to have development on the Superfund site. We wanted to clarify that one up front as well. We spent a lot of time at the first charrette and the second charrette talking about the goals and objectives. We've documented those. You'll see a lot of them on the left-hand side of this slide here. Jeff will talk a little bit about those as we go through the different areas within those 700, 800 acres of land that are developable. Those are important goals that I think we've let live on in the form-based code draft that you see in front of you tonight. The charrette that we had in January focused on taking those goals and developing what's called the vision plan for those same 700 acres of land. Where all of the red development shows up on the plan here, we identified character districts, zones for those areas where the development have similarities, differences. Those items became very important for developing the code, so that when you look at it from more of a regulatory perspective, a zoning perspective, a form-based code, how do you start to think about those land areas in those different character districts? And Jeff will talk a lot about what the differences are between those. That's really the framework for what we have done to date that's led to the draft that you see before you today. I think it's important steps that have been the last 10 months of our process and goes back a couple of years. We met with the task force last Thursday, and the task force that felt that it was really important that we share a couple of updates that came out of that meeting. One, that there was an interest from the task force, mostly from the Tewksbury side, about looking a little bit more carefully at the character districts, about what we have in the draft code today, to potentially change that from a mixed-use commerce over to potentially an employment park. That conversation happened last Thursday. That, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, on the second bullet here, the character district that's currently shown on the landfill site, the Superfund site, that the intent of that was to be removed. So we're going to remove that in the next draft as well. And that the comment period that we're about to embark upon tonight, the public comment period, in our initial project schedule, we had a shorter time frame. We're actually going to expand that time frame to give the public the ability to look at this draft over a longer period of time. So we're now targeting a 6-week comment period to elongate that, and we'll explain that a little bit later in the evening tonight. And then overall, that the project schedule get lengthened. I know this is a very monumental event, and with that comes the need to have the time to digest these things and move forward. So the task force really embraced the idea about looking at extending this process, not to prolong it, but really to give it time to sink in and get that feedback that we're looking for as well. So I think in the next meeting that we come to, we'll be proposing some alternative dates to the October town meeting that we anticipated. It's probably going to be later to spring town meeting as well, what we're going to be targeting. So Jeff's going to lead us through some of the macro items of the structure of the form-based code, and then we'll get into the details. So Jeff, you want to come join?
Where this is being taped, I don't know if it, could we take this off the mic? Oh, you're going to sit down, okay.
Yeah, because Jeff is a little bit shorter than Jeffrey, so I'm just going to go ahead and sit down. For the sake of the mic, and where do we go? The form-based code itself, I'm going to walk you through it, so it won't promise to be an exciting thing, but with the code in your hand, you can follow along and get to maybe a little bit better understanding about how it's put together and what the different pieces mean. At the very beginning is a piece, I believe it's actually the first page without even a number, how to use this code. And it's intended for the layperson, how to walk through it. If you own property that's going to be developed inside of an existing regulating plan, or if you've got a larger property, you're coming up with a regulating plan, et cetera. It's designed to be used and to be understandable by people. Table of contents following on that. The first real meat of the code gets to be on page 5, regulating plans. These are quite simply similar to zoning maps, but these are plans that have regulations attached to them. There are two different kinds. The first, a framework plan. This is the overall plan, and based on the vision plan, like any good form-based regulations, they have to be based on a vision. So here's your vision plan, here's the framework plan. See the two. The framework plan is really what it says. It sets the overall framework. It sets the boundaries for these different character districts within which there are special rules that will push towards their character. The second kind of regulating plan is a specific regulating plan. This is a plan that would be made for realizing or building one of those character districts. Within each character district, before you can build, you need a regulating plan or plans. And I think you can still hear me whether I'm on or not. This is an example of two regulating plans we've put in the code as examples. on both sides of the freeway, focusing in on the west side. The regulating plan is a very precise document. This is an example. So if someone were coming up with a new regulating plan or on a different property, they could follow the example of what's shown here and in your documents. Regulating plan has a key. It has extra information. You'll notice there's a specific note there about the interchange and what's shown here. A regulating plan is a place where you can have very specific, very precisely site-specific information and rules applied. It's also a place where the code references other things. You see the colors that are in the public space in the streets. Those reference the rules for the buildings that may be built on the private property in the third dimension, form and function. Also, another minor point, you see there are two lines. There's an outer red line at the edge of the block. That's required building line. That means basically start your building here, put the front of your building here. The blue and white line that's set back inside that is a parking setback. So however parking is done, it can be done within that block. That's up to the private sector to figure out exactly how to do it. But the public's rules say don't give us a parking lot out on the edge of the street. It has to be pushed back and hidden. Here's that parking setback line, if I can get my hand not to wiggle, and here's the required building line. So these colors and stripes define the public space that you were to see if you were to drive down the street, walk, or bicycle. And the rules are based on making that public space. Those colors lead you to the building form standards. As I said, these are the rules for the form of the building. It's form and function, but form first. Functions or uses second. There are a few different flavors of these. The first is the general, which is we think of it as the most common type, intended to produce buildings like this, just normal town or city buildings. The rules are arranged. It's a pairing of graphics and what should be simple, clear language. There's some things that a diagram can tell you more precisely and obviously more quickly than words can. There are also some other things that words do better than diagrams. So it's a pairing of those two. You'll see this, we'll talk about this a little bit more later. There's a variety, a flavor of general we call storefront, and it is, I would say, as simple as it sounds. It's the same building, but on the ground floor it has a storefront. Think about, and certainly have seen a bit of it here in Wilmington and Andover, Tewksbury, the Great American Main Street. It's quite a normal thing. Buildings with shops on the ground floor. The next type, town buildings. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here are those buildings very similar to the general, but everything's coming down a little bit in scale. Smaller buildings, less height. It's a reduced form of that. Think small apartment buildings, townhouses. Again, the set of rules, where before general was showing, on that example, minimum 3 stories, maximum 5. The town is showing minimum 2, maximum 3. So that also lot widths tend to come down, etc. The tech shop, a play on the workshop, but with a technical 21st century bent perhaps. Some examples of the kind of architecture it could produce. This is a type that's really about jobs, very flexible on its uses. Can be 1 story. It has to be a 20-foot high story, so it has some presence on the street that also fits with what tends to happen in workshop or technical shop applications. But an interesting thing here, we're also allowing this to go up to 4 stories. And you've got examples here on the site already of technical buildings that are more than just the 1-story shed. They're starting to go up vertically. This is a 1 to 4 story, but I think you've all been made aware of within 500 feet of the freeway, there's a bonus of an additional 2 stories. So in some cases, these buildings benefit from that. The flex building type, it's almost a stretch to call it a building form standard. It's the loosest. These are used in the employment districts. The rules for this are absolutely simple. The employment district sites tend to be out away, not up against the neighbors, behind trees, at a distance. So the public sector rules on them are kept to a minimum. There's a height cap and a perimeter cap. We also require them to plant more trees on the perimeter. But basically, this building type allows who's ever developing that a huge amount of freedom to do within that large envelope what they need to do for their business. And these are things that are out and not in areas where, on the site plan, they will not be seen unless you go out to them or are in a helicopter taking a flight. And finally, the campus type. The hope is to get some architecture that might look like this, but there's still a lot of variety. This is really a variation in intent on the tech shop. It's about jobs. It's really allowing employment, technology, commerce. And there's, in that character district, and I'm sorry, I can't help but get ahead of myself a little bit, where campus is employed, there's some special rules that will push buildings towards being grouped around courtyards, green courtyards, quads, like a campus we think of. Now, in all of the building form standards, they control height, some minimums, some maximums. These vary. You see the required building line is shown there. Also, the parking setback line, which extends, unless it notes otherwise, it extends vertically. Some minimums, some maximums, basic parameters. There's some things you must do. There are a lot of things you may do. But within those few simple rules, there's a lot of latitude. Second, siding. I think the major thing that you shall do on siding is that required building line. And again, that simply means start your building here. There's great latitude in how deep the building is and what goes on behind that. But a lot of the conventional things like minimum lot, open area, et cetera, are in here in a different form. 2 others, elements at their most simple, windows and doors. And I'd add parenthetically, most of the rules of the form standards about the buildings are focused on the facade of the building. So what happens on the back of the building is there's much less control. The idea being it's out of public view. That's more a matter of that private property owner. So there's more control on the front facade that the public sees and less on the back. And finally, use, and you see in this example, it's quite a broad number of uses allowed on the ground floor. In this case, residential or commerce. Above the ground floor, residential or commerce. One specific thing, no retail above the ground floor. There are actually some very specific circumstances you can do that, but the rule is retail, if you're going to have it, needs to be on the ground. The code also, Chapter 4, has public realm standards. Now, in a form-based code, the public realm is more designed and more controlled than normal, because that's what the public gets. The first element of that are the street types. Where streets are put in, there's some very specific prescriptions for how those are. Wide sidewalks in most cases, wide sidewalks, street trees planted in such a way that they actually have a chance to grow. Building frontage is controlled, and much like the graphic you see up here on the upper right, that public space between the building facades is really well considered. The private sector is the blank area outside of that. That's sort of their side of the partnership. In addition to that, there's standards for the streetscape, how often you plant the trees, things 30 foot on center, 40 foot on center, the collection of species that you're allowed to use on the public street or on private, in the private yards. And the standards for squares and greens are really basic standards to make sure that these are public, in public view, open spaces that are usable, not overly designed, fancy, kind of hiding places behind berms, but public spaces with green or brick, trees planted, and open to public view all the way through. Parking standards, beginning on Chapter 5, page 57. I'm not going to get so much into the numbers here, but the basic idea is this parking is done in a targeted way. We're looking at different areas where there's a wildly different circumstance in different ways. Generally, the parking standards that we've been using across the United States for about the last 50 years are very strange things. They're supposedly very scientific, and we treat them as if they're fact, but they're not. They're designed for a world which rarely exists, and generally inappropriate, and this is a correction for that. As an example, looking at the vision plan, the mixed-use district on the east side of the freeway. In terms of the amount of parking you're going to need there, it's informed by several things. There are multiple connections to the outside world, different ways people can go. It is mixed use, so you get chances for ride sharing and efficiencies. It is to be a park once environment. So if you're there because you want to go to a restaurant or buy something, or you live there, that doesn't add up to 3 parking places. You can park once and walk a few hundred feet in any direction and be confronted with all those choices that a good downtown gives you, a good town center. So there are parking standards and reductions that are set for that kind of environment, and they're quite a bit different than the ones that are set, for example, the employment pod down on the south. That is going to be, it really has one connection, one way in and out. And it is going to be, in gross terms, surely a single use. I mean, there may be multiple businesses down there, but it's going to be pretty much all one type of business. You're not going to get a great deal of shared parking based on that. I will point out that in the code there, in all of these instances, everyone is encouraged to get involved with your existing TMO. I'm going to use the wrong term there, but plug into existing things where some parking reductions are available if you have a shuttle system, ride sharing, et cetera. So we're not ignoring those things, but we're acknowledging that it's a different parking situation. If you're driving down to that employment center on the south, your car needs a parking place. If you're talking about it for that activity, if you're talking about an activity in the mixed use area, one parking place can serve several places. So the reality and the science of what the amount of parking that's needed is a reduction. That comes down so you use the land more efficiently. There's that one way in and out. Function and use. This is one area where fundamentally a form-based code is different. Conventional codes you might call use-based codes. Form-based codes have form first, but we also have use. There is a use table on many of the building form standards. There's a differentiation between what's on the ground floor and what's up above. But in comparison to existing code, you've got a set of pulled together categories within which there's great flexibility. If someone's going to change from, and I'm sorry, I go again to a retail use. If somebody has a bookstore and they want to change to a shoe store, that's not a big, that should be their own business and not something that requires a lot of paperwork. And the code can take it in some instances quite a bit further than that. And again, in all the building form standards, you'll see that last section, use, spells out what those broad categories are. The form standard itself doesn't get into some of the specificity of where in the table you see there's some uses that can be special exceptions, so there's a little bit of extra control if there's anything iffy about it. But in general, a form-based code is much more forgiving on uses, much more precise on forms. So the business sector has an easier time of it. They can do multiple things within the given form. Definitions, simply put, there are some things, it's in a way the thing we're pursuing, certainly in the mixed-use center, is a kind of a different world than conventional zoning. So there's some terms that are going to be specific to making a town that aren't used in conventional zoning. There's a definition section. Whenever you see in the code there's a word that is in small caps, that means that the code means that in a very precise way that you'll find in the definition section. We try and use that technique, by the way, as little as possible. If it seems like there's a small cap every 3 lines.
Okay.
Matt.
Great. So thanks very much. I'm Matt Waller. I'm with Robinson & Cole, and we are, as Carol described, as legal consultants for the project. I'm just going to touch briefly on the review processes, the application process, the review process that your planning boards are going to be involved in. And we really tried here to tap into the existing approval processes that you have under current zoning and not try to reinvent any wheels, but really try to stay within what you're already doing as much as we can. We did create in this form-based code one intertown body, which is called the Tri-Town Development Area Review Group, and that's made up of the 3 town planners, essentially. And their role really is to review and advise either the building inspector or the building commissioner or the planning board in each town on development proposals that come through under the code. And so you can see in the example that Jeff has actually put on the slide for me, in 703A, there are 7 instances in which the TDARG, or however you want to refer to it, is going to be advising or playing a role. So it may be holding a pre-application conference with an applicant. It may determine whether a certificate of consistency should be issued for a particular project that's going through a building permit-like review. It may make a recommendation to the planning board in terms of a minor development review process, which is somewhat akin to site plan. And then it may also make a recommendation on a major development review similarly. And then also on a site-specific regulating plan, as Jeff was describing, it'll be very much like a special permit review process. And then there are also instances in which it's allowed to make recommendations to the planning board on allowing administrative allowances, which is a little bit different than a variance, and then also variance as well. And then finally, in terms of enforcement of the code, advising the building inspector or building commissioner on that. Just to touch briefly on administrative allowances, these are a little different than variances as I described. They are, as Jeff has described in other contexts, sort of whoops allowances that say that within a certain collar, within a certain tolerance, a planning board can permit a development that comes through to exceed a certain standard. And there's a few shown in this slide. Height, for example, can be allowed up to 5%. For a total area, or up to 10% for any one story. Street walls up to 10%. These are things that, because the form-based code can't account for particular site conditions in the initial instance, there is an allowance for these things to be exceeded, and planning boards are given the authority to do that. As I said, there is a minor development review process, and this is for projects that are essentially under 50,000 square feet of gross floor area, that are either located somewhere in the framework plan and don't require a site-specific regulating plan, or there is a site-specific regulating plan in place already. And this is essentially, as I described, a building permit process. And the intent is for a proponent to submit information that would demonstrate compliance with the code as part of a building permit application. The building inspector would then review that, refer that out to the TDARG to review it. The TDARG would then recommend whether a certificate of consistency should be issued, and then it would come back to the building inspector to either issue the permit or not issue the permit. And so that's really intended to be parallel with totally administrative as part of a building permit process. And the appeal of that would then be to a ZBA. Major development review is for projects that are greater than 50,000 square feet, but similar to a minor development project, they are located either somewhere in the framework plan where they already have standards, they're within a site-specific regulating plan that has standards for them, but they are larger projects. And in this instance, the project is going to get sent to the planning board first, and it will go through essentially a site plan review process, but this is not a special permit site plan review process, it's a non-special permit site plan review process. And overall, it goes through, the intent is for it to be wrapped up in 90 days. It would be referred out, the application would be referred out to the TDARG, other town boards. Those town boards would report back to the planning board, and the planning board would hold a hearing and then make a decision. And then finally, sort of the most involved process is going to be site-specific regulating plan review. This is where a site-specific regulating plan that is going to be creating new standards on land will come through. So this is a place where the framework regulating plan does not provide for standards, mainly because streets don't exist in the area that you're dealing with. And this really will occur in parallel with a subdivision review process. Similar process to, not similar, but basically a special permit review process. Again, it comes to the planning board. The planning board will refer it out to the review group, refer it out to a number of town boards. It will also refer it to the other 2 towns' planning boards. And they will then submit comments on it. Finally, there'll be a public hearing and a decision will be rendered on the special permit. The intent here, consistent with the prior development site designations in all 3 towns, is that this process gets done in 180 days. It's not intended to be sort of an open-ended process. An appeal of any decision made here would go through a normal 40A17 appeal, like you would do with any typical special permit. So that really is the 3 tiers. There's minor, major, and site-specific regulating plan. And then, as we were describing earlier, the one tweak that we've got that's different than what you normally do now is these administrative allowances, which we can talk about a bit more if you'd like. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff now.
I'm going to talk more about the character districts themselves in the framework plan and what they're after. Again, based on the vision plan, I'd say I can't say that too much, but it's kind of a reification of the vision. 7 districts. The riverfront up at the top, infill, campus, mixed-use center, the 2 employment centers, and the commerce, or the mixed-use commerce center. Now, something that's added since the June 3rd talk is that, the Superfund site is going to be taken off the table. They won't be included in character districts. They're beyond question not included. And something, it looks, the framework plan is a little bit like a zoning map, and then it covers everything. The reality of what's developable is another thing entirely. On this plan, which is a preliminary look at what might be developable and what the constraints are, it is only the completely white areas that are developable. And of course, some of those are completely isolated, so there are other questions. Included, there's some areas that look to be kind of a light pale blue. Those areas are habitat areas, which may be mitigatable, maybe not. In our conservative assumptions, we're taking those at 50%. So the numbers you heard about developable area was looking at 50% of those areas. There's a lot less land here than it initially looks like. And there's that Superfund type site, which is taken off the table. Character District 1, the riverfront, and now we're really only talking about the piece on the north side of the road. This is really, it's about, jobs and business are included, but it's quite a bit about protecting Mother Nature, protecting the river. Here's that site again up on the north, a close-up. What you let's see how the laser's doing. This line is a building limit line. So what we're talking about here is buildable area is up next to the road. Area behind that is to be kept open and conserved. That becomes effectively part of the park. So that's the line between Mother Nature and the man-made stuff. This is the character that's envisioned. There will be buildings there, but also a fair part of the property is going to be open space. District number 2, infill. This is the vision plan. You can see a lot of areas is taken up by Mother Nature. Here it is, looking pretty massive in the character district, but a lot of that's hard to get to. Very much an area that's about jobs. Now, in this plan, you see the framework streets. I'd like to take care to point those out. Those are definitely there, but there's a lot of area in between. Now, these blue lines are a layer I left on. They're DEP wetlands, supposedly open water, but there's some inaccuracy to that, we imagine. But you can certainly understand these are kind of minimums. These are showing areas that are Mother Nature. There's no 50-foot or 100-foot setback. So these areas, if anything, they give you a notion of where there's some real undevelopable land, but this is very much understated. Gives you a hint of what's involved. And again, the character of this infill, very much about jobs, framework streets and new streets. We do have standards for street trees, et cetera. So the public part of this area will be presentable, will be very civil. But these are jobs, these are places about making things, very much like the character of the area right now. Corporate campus, way over on the west side of the freeway, is an area that's similarly about jobs, but the decision has been made to try and give it the character of a campus, collection of open spaces. There it is in the plan in the upper left. Looks quite massive, but I'd remind you of the power lines of that strip going from lower right to upper left. They take a whack out of it. And then the river, so the developable land is really concentrated to the east and to the south. Sorry about doing that too fast. And the controls on architecture here are quite varied. If this is developed, the builders could choose a variety of styles, things like you see here, things colonial. A lot of that is left to them. The mixed-use center, District 3, these are images from the vision plan and a 3D model that was done of that. This is where you get my technical term is sort of the full monte of the form-based code and the mixed-use center. There it is to the right of the freeway and the mustard color, maybe that's the Lakers. The framework streets within it, more than usual. These exact locations are not prescribed, but all these connections have to be made. Part of what we're proposing, I'll go ahead and talk about it now, is right here, here, and here. That's where we're splicing into either of the exchange, the freeway exit designs we were shown by AECOM. And we think it's far enough back that can be resolved there. There's plenty of room for whichever design they choose. But at those spots where you see that line, that simple line, that's where we're completely plugging into. It's all their design, not part of this design. Also, this piece where it crosses the wetlands here from there to there is exactly to their plan. So we're really splicing into their technical directions. And the character image for the mixed-use center, people, streets, businesses, places to eat lunch. The character districts, I'm not talking about both 5 and 7. Initially, 5 was of a different character, but it's now an employment district. Employment parks. When we were working on the vision plan and looking at the constraints, it looked to us like there were really 3 developable areas that may prove wrong or it may prove off, but it looks pretty certain to us there. These are very much about jobs. The building form standard here is flex. You'll see how these are all relatively away. There tends to be a wetland, wooded areas, or a setback between all of these areas and the neighbors. And you see you get some idea of really down here, the really extensive wetlands, which make any sort of building very, very interesting. But there are sites there, but consideration. And note the framework streets here. Specifically on the Northern District, this one is a little bit different than the others because it's the one that really comes right up against single family in the town of Tewksbury. And we're sensitive to that. So we've pulled back, it's a little fuzzy maybe in the slides, but at the very top, that white strip, we've pulled back the boundaries of the rezoning. So there's an area there that would retain its zoning. Where that really big yellow line is, that's an area that is available for single-family houses, just like, frankly, like what you have across the street. So that pattern could continue. In addition to that, because the employment park is something that is such a big change in scale from single-family to employment park, they're almost on opposite ends of the spectrum. We've added this red line, which is a 200-foot setback. Now, it also tends to coincide with some environmental constraints, but it provides a surety, we think, to the residents, the nearby residents there in Tewksbury, that this is going to be a quiet and I'd call it almost invisible, or perhaps not visible, juxtaposition. The character, and I have to say, we're showing these pictures, which show a variation from on the lower right, kind of glass wall, modern, circa 19, I don't know what, maybe 2000 something. And then on the left, a kind of colonial-esque thing. The controls on what the aesthetic of these buildings will be and their arrangement are very loose. All these employment parks, as I said, are out of sight, not out of mind, but out of sight. So there's kind of maximum flexibility there. What governs the aesthetic within these employment parks, I'd say would be the private sector doing what it needs to do, looking out after its own interests, or just doing business or presenting the right corporate image. The Mixed-Use Commerce Center, which is very much like the Mixed-Use Center on the eastern side of the freeway, but on the western side of the freeway, there's a very clear directive. There will not be residential in this center. So in some ways, it can physically look quite a bit the same, but when you're there, certainly after business hours, it will feel a little different. There it sits across the darker brown area. And again, remember how much of that is taken off by the Superfund site. But this is an area for business. Here's where we're splicing onto either of the options for the freeway exchange, and very simple, basic connector road in the framework plan. Again, the character of this, in some ways, it's very likely to be very much the same as on the other side of the freeway, but people won't live there. It's a workplace with very broad parameters on what those commercial uses may be. And ending slide of our character tour district is this juxtaposition between the real Main Street and the real countryside, town and country, both of which you're going to see here a lot of countryside in this study area. Jeffrey?
Thanks, Jeff. I think what we'd like to do now, Carol, is turn it back over to you and to the group here. And just to forecast, at the end of this, I'd like to come back and talk about what's next. Really, it's the 6-week comment period. But now's the point in the evening where we'd like to open up for you to take the lead on the comment period.
Thank you. What I'd like to do first is open it up to questions and comments from members of the Planning Board. And then I'll recognize folks in the audience following those comments. Is there anyone that would like to start? Yes, sir.
Question with the permitting process. Notice the terminology in terms of the initial review group by the planning directors or community development director, and then indicating at the stage that the planning board makes the determination. It says, I can find the page, but there's language in there that it gives great weight is given to a determination of this TDGR, or whatever. What is deemed great weight as a, in other words, is there something that once this initial review group makes a recommendation, does that carry a weight that has to be overcome by certain preponderance of information, or
That's not the intent.
No.
The intent is that certainly they're going to make a recommendation, that the recommendation, because it's coming from a group whose primary responsibility is to review consistency with this code, that it be given somewhat more weight than not, necessarily other boards in town. But it is not to be in any way tying the hands of the planning board, or the planning board has to have some reason for going against what the review group says. So it's not intended to reduce the discretion of the planning board.
So then how about, has this been implemented where, the appellate process, has actually been implemented in a situation where this form-based code has been in effect, that the appellate process gives any certain, additional weight to whether the board acted correctly or incorrectly, dependent on the recommendation of the initial review board?
I think in some cases, actually, a review group like this is given more power to tie the hands of whoever is the issuing authority. In some cases, a review group like this can actually be the issuing authority. We're not suggesting that in this case, but we're certainly not intending for this to be something that would in some way reduce the discretion of the board, or an appeal somehow create an appealable issue that if the board went against this review group, that it could then be appealed and found to have been in violation of what the code said.
One thing I would add that I hope is pertinent, the group's review is intended to not be subjective, but simply a recommendation. Did they satisfy all the requirements of the code or not? And the code is written with the conceit. It's an impossibility, but with the conceit of making everything a kind of black or white. You're on this side of the line, yes, or you're on this side of the line, no. So they're intended to be a very an objective process.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question. I was wondering if you might be able to put the larger scale map on the screen for a minute and perhaps orient us, particularly the folks that may not have the actual code in front of them, with some of the existing roads and the access points that will allow the existing roads to intersect with the proposed roads and so forth, just to orient maybe the towns, the roads, and so forth with the different character districts on the plan.
Sorry, I'm getting there. That one is. Oh, God. Sorry. Thank you, Bill Gates.
So I'll start with the vision plan here. If we're looking up on the screen, we have I-93 through here. We have most of Andover up and to the right. Wilmington comes around to the bottom over here. Tewksbury's over on this side. This is the approximate location of where the proposed highway interchange is. And the plan here has the character districts. This is one character district up in here, which is called the Research Employment Infill. Actually, let me go to the next slide. That shows the different character districts. So again,
You have to show Valley Street as well,
sure.
because that's a,
thank you. Oop, bear with me a second. Ballardville Street runs down through here. And there's existing highway interchange down at the bottom here as well. Shawshene River runs another landmark up towards the north part here as well. We have South Street over here as another reference point. And we have the existing rail line that runs up through the middle of the plan here as well. Some key land features. The Pfizer properties, another couple of key land features up here to the north. Procter & Gamble down in here as well. And then if I go to the character districts plan, you can see those same features, the Shawshene up in here, and the couple of character districts, the Campus Character District, and the Riverfront Development District up in here. This will animate to show those again. I'll wait for it to finish its animation and come back. As it goes from the north down to the south, highlighting each of those districts. But again, we have the highway through here as well. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great, thanks.
I think I'll go back up to hopefully this plan here and leave it on that slide.
other questions or comments?
I haven't had an opportunity, but to go back to part 2, the regulating plans, and then the specific plans, you have some descriptions of each use district in these regulating plans that say permitted street types in the mixed-use centers are MU 108/72, S80-48. You have different types of street use centers, and it's not really clear as what that description of those types mean, at least just looking at it quickly, and it may be important to really delineate those actual street
The types themselves are in the public realm standards, starting on about page 51, actually 52.
Well, it may be important then to tie it back to the front to say, go to those specific, and it may be here, like I said, I haven't read everything, was kind of trying to absorb as much as I could.
I had a similar question, similar, I think, in the application process. It's always the kind of what-if scenario, and I understand a lot of the character and uses of these areas were generated through charrettes, and so the kind of what we rely on a developer to come through and propose a certain specific project for a certain character district. And what if a proposal comes through which maintains a similar character yet wants to change the use in the campus area and permit residential and so forth? How does the planning board review that, and how what is the concern on the appeal process associated with that?
The administrative, they're not allowed, actually, the board would not be allowed to alter use provisions through that special permit process. So if you look, administrative allowances do not include things related to use or variances. And a variance obviously is the ZBA's purview, not a planning board's. So if an applicant came through and said, instead of this use or this building type, which is permitted here, I want to have a different building type with different uses, that would be a matter that would have to go through the ZBA process under the normal variance standards, correct.
And I would add to that a little bit. Examine and look at some of those specific cases, because the parameters for use tend to be so very inclusive, and the building types themselves, as Matt called it, are actually quite broad. So there's an awful lot of leeway within these rules.
And actually, just to close that loop, if you look on page 76 of the code, use variances are actually prohibited in general, and I'm trying to remember whether either any of these towns actually currently permit use variances. I don't know if you do or you don't. Okay, so consistent with that, there really is no ability to change a use designation here unless you go back to town meeting and get a revision to the zoning itself.
So certainly, yeah, so with that in light, we really want to feel confident that we have the uses set before going forward.
I know this is a lot for people to absorb since they haven't had it very long too. Steve?
Raised the issue that came up at the Tri-Town Task Force. I'd mentioned that the Tewksbury Planning Board had taken a vote of changing character district on the west side from the mixed-use commercial to an employment park, and we started having the dialogue last Thursday with the consultants, but I think it may be helpful to just have the conversation as far as what we could see under an employment park or infill district that we wouldn't be able to see under the mixed use. In other words, to allow us to have more information as to what would be the appropriate character district for Tewksbury there.
Yes, and apologies for throwing something new at you. But understanding what the issues were with the mixed-use commerce center, I think we can handle those very easily. We recommend against going to the employment park with the flex building form standard because this site has the same kind of visibility as the campus site does. Part of the reason the campus site is campus and not employment center is it's likely to be highly visible. So we have more careful building form controls. And what I believe is we could simply call this piece by another name and adjust the uses. And perhaps it's just the Commerce Center. It's the name infill, since there's nothing to infill here, was a little bit problematic. But we could call it the Commerce Center or something which is clearly about jobs, about industry, research, development. So it would have the same flexibility for uses, very broad, with the exception of no residential. But we'd still have the form controls so that you would get presentable buildings and streets and blocks to this highly visible site. That should be a pretty positive case situation for the private sector. And then, but it still retains some protection of the public's interests.
I have a question on page 87. Under administrative allowances and variances in paragraph A, it says, an applicant seeking approval of a minor development proposal may seek planning board approval of one or more administrative allowances by including such request in its application for a certificate of consistency. But I thought that minor development proposals did not come before the planning board.
Correct. They don't, except if you're looking for an administrative allowance. And in that case, the building inspector would receive that and say, this has to go to administrative allowance to the planning board first before it can proceed this way.
And then how does that affect the time frame?
It would expand the time frame. So it would have to go through, I think essentially the same time frame that a major development would go through in terms of going to the planning board and being reviewed and sent back. That's something that we could look at if we wanted to create a process within this that said it's a shorter time frame where it goes to it doesn't require a public hearing, for example. We could treat that differently.
I think if it's going to loop to the planning board, there has to be an articulated time frame.
Right.
Otherwise, it won't happen, you know. Right. Are there advertising requirements? I mean, if it's coming before the planning board, the advertising, timing, posting.
If you're doing a public hearing, you will do what you do typically do for a public hearing today. There's not an intent to create a different public hearing requirement.
Would a request for an administrative allowance at the planning board level be just a discussion item, or would it be a matter, would it be a public hearing?
Well, I think we're actually having a discussion about that right now. I think it could be either.
Okay.
So it's sort of up to the, the comments that we're going to get in this process could help us inform how we want to do that. If there's a feeling that an administrative allowance maybe really shouldn't require a public hearing for something that's going through minor development review, maybe that's the way to approach it. If it's going through, obviously, major development review, it's going to have a public hearing already.
Okay. I don't feel strongly one way or the other, except that whatever you decide, I think, ought to be really carefully articulated. Another question. How many stakeholders are there in the entire development area? And how are they doing? Do they, I mean, I know they've been involved throughout the process. I mean, I'm thinking things like no-build zones and more no-build zones, and I'm wondering if all the people who actually own the parcels of land are on board with the shape that this is taking.
I can't answer all of those questions for you, Lynn, but I will say that the comments will come from the stakeholders as well. They haven't had any advanced knowledge of the form-based code than this group right now. So they're hearing this and being walked through this at the same time as everyone else. So I expect there will be comments through the process. I know that there are not a lot of stakeholders there, and I don't have the exact number.
I believe it's about 6. And so it's a small number of stakeholders that we're dealing with.
I think it's also, if I may also add that during the process, we had interviews with the stakeholders, and stakeholders participated in the charrettes as well. So though they're getting the form-based code as it was posted publicly yesterday, there has been a process of communicating and sharing information and participation with the stakeholders throughout.
I would say
and the task force as well.
There are 6 large stakeholders, like development paths. That doesn't include, existing stakeholders or existing businesses along Balleville Street or smaller land holdings. When I say 6, I'm talking large chunks of land that, this would have the most impact on those.
Undeveloped.
Yeah, undeveloped land.
And do any of those span town boundaries?
Yes.
And then did the character districts follow largely from ownership interests and town boundaries? That would be a logical way to do.
Character
was it just like warfare?
The character districts cross the ownership boundaries from one district to another. So some owners might be in multiple districts, for example, and multiple town areas. For example, the East Side Mixed-Use Center, I believe there's some slivers of Tewksbury land over in there, as well as Andover land in there. They bridge across both of those as well. So there are some circumstances where that happens.
One of the goals of this whole process has been to provide consistent zoning across the 3 towns, so that a developer with a parcel of, maybe not the character district, but with an owner with a parcel of land knows what the expectations are, whether they're developing in Andover or in Tewksbury or in Wilmington.
I have more, but I don't want to hog the mic.
Okay. Why don't we open it to the public as well, and we can come back to the boards too. I would ask you if you would please go to the microphone so that you're able to be heard. Sir? And identify yourself.
My name is Jerry Dijon. I live in Wilmington at 32 Salem Street. And to put it into a little bit better perspective, can you do it with a pointer on the map or approximately where we're located here at the town hall? And possibly the line of Tewksbury and Wilmington on the Salem Street near Route 93.
Salem Street's really off the map here. It isn't on the map. And the town hall is nowhere on
I
there.
think the town,
So,
93, and I see 93 there.
yeah, McDonald Road, is at the bottom of the purple here, at the bottom of the, very bottom of the bottom purple, right there, Paul, thank you. Over to the right more? To the right? McDonald Road ends right there. Salem Street's down here.
All right, thank you.
And from Andover, you know, this is Lowell Junction, this is Ballardville or River Street leading into Ballardville, which would be off the map, Ballardville Village.
Right.
I'm Michael Shampoo. I'm a selectman in Wilmington. My question is, as I look at all this stuff, and I've been participating in some of these conversations, I have a tendency to think about it in terms of the way we live today. The way I drive, the way I work, the places I go. And the code, at least to my understanding, is intended to give us a framework for 10 years, 30, 50, 80, maybe more years hence from now. So I have, I guess, two questions related to that. One is, what's the mechanism in the code, and maybe this is a legal question, for reevaluating, reestablishing a code to accommodate the technology that we can't conceive of today? Travel technology, automobile technologies, rail or hovercraft technologies, or whatever. I joke, kind of. And I guess I'll leave it at that. So that's a blended question. What about the future? What about the technologies that we haven't even conceived of? These designs are based on today. What about tomorrow? And what is the mechanism within the code to accommodate the future of these different kinds of technologies? I'm interested in that. And that's not discussion I've heard an awful lot about in this development process of the code. So thanks for whoever's going to take this one on.
I think it's a short answer at the moment, which is that the code doesn't, at the moment, have a special mechanism for dealing with changes to technology 10, 20, 30 years from now. If something arose that was a huge technology that changed the way we occupy the land, I think you would go back like you do with any zoning code and make amendments that would go through the same process we're going through today.
Right. It really isn't any different than the zoning that we have right now before us, conventional zoning that we have in each of our towns. We'd have to do the same thing.
So our Tri-Town task force would continue to live 50 years down the line, we'd have to get together again.
Absolutely.
Keep my email.
I had a question, Carol, the same expansion of time thought that Lynn had. There is an occasion, I think it's for the site-specific process, that for a special permit, it will involve the 3 planning boards to take a look at a specific plan. How do we move that process along so that we meet the 180-day requirement and not slow projects down?
It's a referral out. There's not a public hearing requirement in the other 2 towns. So the board would bring it up at the next meeting that they have. And it's a 45-day process. When it's referred out, it's 45 days. And if the planning boards aren't able to speak to that, then that planning board that's running that process is permitted to move forward without those comments in.
Okay.
So it won't, the intent is not to hold up the process, for a variety of referrals. Everyone should refer in a time, comment in a timely way.
And I would expect that would that happen often?
I think I think the expectation is that there will be a number of these specific plans that will come through. It'll depend on how big they are when they come through. You may get a handful that are very large, or you may get more that are smaller. But I think the idea is that there are processes now that the towns have where you refer things out to other boards in town and expect to get comments back from them, and the process moves the way it does. So the intent is certainly not to slow it down. I don't know if Paul has to add.
Well, I was going to say, it may be helpful if you can expand on how the site-specific project would move forward first, then a major development and a minor. I think the way it was explained was good, but it was almost reversed. And so the first thing that the boards would see is kind of like the special permit process, and it would be the major site review process. And so maybe I'll just turn over to you guys to talk about how that would be facilitated if Joe Developer walked through the door with a site-specific regulating plan for the east side. Just a hypothetical scenario.
I think the best way to think of it is as a master plan-like process, in that they're going to come forward with a plan that looks like what Jeff did for this mixed-use center on the eastern side of the interstate. That will be then the zoning controls by which either minor or major development proposals will be reviewed. So they will come after, or perhaps currently with one of these plans coming forward.
But that's really when the planning board has the opportunity to really wrestle.
At that initial specific plan review process, the specific regulating plan.
And that's a crucial point, because that's where you have this incredible leverage. Instead of reacting to one project at a time, you set the playing field for the whole area. So you make planning decisions in advance. And when you have a specific regulating plan like this, there's an awful lot that's inherent in it, the rules that go with it. At a certain level of abstraction, the character is predetermined. It'll certainly vary depending on who's building it and how the economy is, et cetera. But you're making your planning decisions up front.
I think the major exception to that is likely to be infill development in Andover, where there are existing roads and there are existing standards shown on the framework plan. You may see development proposals come through that are not going to go through first a specific regulating plan process. They may just come forward as a development project along Lowell Junction Road, for example.
Matt, what happens in the case of a property owner that spans two towns for a regulating plan? Would that prompt a public hearing in each of the communities that are involved?
It would.
And it could be simultaneous?
I think the hope would be that it would be simultaneous and that it wouldn't have to be sequential. To do otherwise, you'd have to get special legislation at the state to permit, sort of a single review body to review a proposal that spanned two towns. I don't think that that's currently on the menu.
We've seen it certainly in subdivision plans that have spanned more than one community.
And I would say something unique as a site-specific regulating plan that crosses two municipalities, that maybe it's an opportunity for the boards to get together like this to review that plan in a more comprehensive manner, because it would be so unique. There's probably only two instances where that may happen. And so it may be worthwhile for the two sides to get together rather than running from one meeting to another.
Stan.
Yes, Stan Franzine. Just to follow up to the gentleman's question from Wilmington, does the form-based code address anything like a regional transportation center or a new commuter railroad station along the tracks there in the Lowell Junction area?
I apologize, I forgot to mention it. It is definitely planned, and actually this example, I can't stand in the right place now. This example regulating plan is based on a rail station, so it's feeding and tied to that, as are, and that's roughly about right here.
Where's that in relation to the current Valley Vale stop?
It's off the map. It's up the map. To the north of Valley Vale stop, to the south of Wilmington stop, both off the map.
The other consideration that's given in the form-based code is a credit for parking if you are near a facility, a parking facility, or a transportation node. You're allowed to reduce your parking to accommodate folks coming in a different method. Yes, sir.
Michael Lampier. I have a question that gets to the timing of the form-based code versus the interchange project. We're contemplating that we may enable new zoning early next year now. And I think this is a question that could apply to the entire area, but just using the mixed-use center on the east side as an example, certainly there are practical limitations on what can be developed there right now. But when the new zoning is enabled and the interchange is not in place, how has that been addressed in the form-based code? It seems like it could possibly be more restrictive on development, and you're almost shutting off development until the interchange comes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how that is. Second question would be, let's say the enabling zoning is in place, and this gets to the process question, okay? And I'm Joe Developer, and I come in, and I need I have a 40,000 square foot use in the mixed use center. It seems like the landowner or a developer who would be marketing to that one user is going to be pushed through a very significant process for a regulating plan in order to get that use in. And so I'm wondering, how do you get that first building in? This envisions something 20 years, 30 years down the line, the full build out. How does that first building go in if that's in fact how it comes along? Okay.
I'm happy to, the first question having to do with timing of the interchange vis-a-vis the zoning is one that at the moment is not in the code. There is not a sort of a relief valve that says if the interchange is not built within a certain amount of time that this code doesn't work, or that until the interchange is built that the code will not be in effect. I think that that's something we want to consider as we're moving forward and as we are sort of getting closer to the point at which this becomes more real. We're certainly willing to look at it, and there are various ways to handle that. You could adopt this potentially as an overlay. I know that that hasn't been the way that this has been proceeded so far, but it's something that should be considered. You could also have a delayed effective date that would only come in when the interchange was actually in place, and then once development occurred, it would no longer be an overlay, it would actually be the base zoning. So those are different ways to handle it, and I think that as we get comments in this process, we're certainly going to be looking at that very closely and determining what to do in terms of the timing of the interchange versus timing of development.
Second part. I'll take the hard part of that question, the second part. To a fair degree, getting to that threshold of doing the first specific regulating plan is a big step. The advantage is the steps after that for putting buildings within that regulating plan are much easier. But to a degree, and I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong, there's kind of no way around it. To do planning, cohesive planning of an area, there's a first step. The code does have a minimum size for a regulating plan, and it's something we've had some discussions about. An initial internal draft was 40 acres, which is our council just blanched, which is not workable. It's kind of ideal. I believe we're now at 10 acres. And that's kind of a minimum size so that you're actually doing planning and not just plunking down a building. So no doubt that first step is the hardest, but thereafter you sort of got a landing pad for the rest of the development.
But I guess just to follow up on my question, in your mind, is that 40,000 square foot building on an existing street?
No.
No. Yeah. Then what you just described would be what you'd be going through. If you happen to be on an existing street, then it's obviously a much different process.
And so, clearly my point is a couple of obstacles that should be worked on together and attempting to overcome to the extent that they can.
Nancy.
Thank you, Carol. I don't think this is on. It is on. Oh, thank you. For us or anyone in the hall, I'm curious going forward. I was really happy that you've extended the comment period because I know myself, just about every page I have a question. But can we have a dialogue, or is it just simply, a one-shot, here's our comments, and that's it? Or are boards or committees, able to have a dialogue, ask questions, and get some information back, and then react to that? How is that going to work? That's my only question.
That's a really good question, and I don't know that we have a really good answer for that, but I think that the suggestion of a dialogue is very important, and I certainly would hope we'd all be open to getting together again to try to hash some issues out. We might want to start with directing some questions to the individual planners. We can get together and start trying to address some of those, come back with answers, but I think you're absolutely right that at some point in time we're going to find it necessary to sit down and talk again.
Thank you.
Rhonda, sorry.
Code just briefly. In Part 3, you identify the building form standards allowed in each character district. And on page 23, that form that you have set up lists the 6 or 7 districts, and it lists 5 building form standards. I wanted to see if there's a way we can tie that a little bit to the allowable uses, which is on page 77, that form or code. It actually has 6 building type standards. It inserts storefront in as a standard, which is not on your character district chart. And, is that kind of straddled between general use and town use, the storefront use? And then is it a possibility somehow on this page, you either go back to the mixed use district or add this chart again, and because you don't know if you're in the flex area, what kind of use you can have, because you only have like the flex or employment parks is the only allowed, and so the flex design is just kind of trying to tie it together a little bit for allowable uses, building form standard, and what district you're in.
The first part about the number of standards is an oops. It's a mistake. We will fix that. And the second part we'll take a real hard look at. That's a good point.
Have we reached saturation at this point? Let's go on to next steps, Jeffrey.
I was trying to avoid having to go through these, so bear with me as I try plan B of getting to the end of the show.
It's a good impression.
Right. This is the fast version of tonight's show.
Even better this
All right. Okay, so here we go. Thanks. So the next step in this, as of tonight, opens the public comment period, the 6-week period that we've talked about. I wanted to point out a couple things. On the top here is the Tri-Town website. It's a www.vhb.com/tri-town-FBC. If you go to that project website, there you'll find under the documents page a lot of the information that we presented tonight. It'll include a draft of the hard copy of the 90 or so page draft form-based code. It'll include a copy of tonight's presentation, and it will also include, as what's shown up in the back here, what's called that framework regulating plan as a larger graphic, because I know some of them are small, so we included a larger format drawing of that as well. And in addition to that, it'll have the contact information for the 3 town planners, Paul Matarazzo, Steve Sadwick, and Carol Hamilton from the 3 different towns. And we're asked that you provide your comments via email or regular mail to them, and the addresses are listed as well. And the comments are due at the end of the 6-week period, which is July 20th. So we're very much looking forward to getting those comments. And I think so far as next steps, after that comment period closes, we're planning to coordinate, as we have been throughout this process, with the 3 town planners to get a better sense of what this might mean about follow-up, about when the town meeting process might happen. I know we're already thinking to spring of 2011, but we'll fine-tune that and update the website and the task force accordingly after that 6-week period. So we're very much looking forward to the comments. And I think that's it for us, Carol.
And I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and all of the attention that you've paid to this presentation, and look forward very much to hearing your feedback and your questions and concerns. If you haven't signed in when you came in, if you would please, at the back, there's a table there.